What's up, guys? So I wanted to give you guys a breakdown on how I start these pieces. The first video of this is I released last Monday. I'll toss it in the description below, so if you want to check it out. It basically talks about me, my whole sketching phase and process and how I go about it, more or less, with some other mouth vomit. But anyway, with this piece, I wanted to break down kind of how I approach the actual line work stage to then blocking things in and giving things three-dimensionality. So for the first I would say the first like 10-ish minutes of the video, right now I'm just going over and blocking everything in. We're like reworking shapes. A lot of this stuff is just placeholders. When I sketch things out, it's never usually like always going to be the end product when I sketch and put it on the canvas. Usually things shift based on interest level, the design of my head, how compelling it is to the overall character that I'm creating right now. For example, when I first sketched this character, I don't think I had a crown on him, and then when I at some point later on decided, oh, the crown would be cool, why not? I've never done that before. I think the armor plate ended up changing at one point as well. But it's basically me just kind of working back through things, just building up a gray value just to give things some three-dimensionality, as I said earlier, and slowly like working through the piece and cleaning stuff up so I have a better idea of the direction I want to take things, whether like as far as shape and texture, along with just the structure of things. As I work back through here, I make a lot of general decisions as far as design choices, as far as like the crown will shift a lot as we get through this, along with the skull itself. I originally wanted to go with a normal skull without a mandible bone, and then as I progressed through this piece and started building up the other areas of the illustration, I decided that I wanted to give it I wanted to give him a lower jaw, basically. I thought it's a little more fitting, I guess. It looked a little more creepy, I suppose. I really like the idea of no lower jaw when I'm painting skulls. I'm just a huge fan of skulls without a jaw. Just a weird design thing for me. So anytime I paint skulls, I always try to avoid the lower jaw, but I felt like it was fitting. So anyway. Yeah, I'm just basically going back through and slowly incorporating like slightly lighter values to build up some layer and form on certain areas to kind of generate the image I'm seeing in my head, and then fixing things along the way, slowly building in the background, going back and tweaking things that stand out to me. A lot of this is just kind of jumping around from different parts of the piece. Like now I'm attacking the armor on his shoulder, and I wasn't really sure how I wanted to approach it. So I was originally going to do the whole rounded bit, but as you saw, I axed that idea and decided that I would just make it like a flat armor piece on his shoulder. And then after that gets settled, I bounce around and start dealing with the crown. And this happens a lot. I bounce around a lot just because you don't really want to hyper focus on one area for too long, because then you start to noodle around in things, and it ends up getting further up as far as the amount of time you spent on it than the rest of the piece, and then the rest of the piece lags behind and it looks weird. So I'm just bouncing around, slowly filling in these areas, adding more value, just building up the shapes, so that way they actually have some three-dimensionality to them. And they have some gravity and weight. So it's basically me just refining and building through this section, deciding on these design elements. For a while, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to approach these straps this way. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to connect to his shoulder. And then I decided, oh yeah, let's put a lower jaw on, because it just kind of looks better, more or less. That was really the only design criteria. Is well, let's toss it in and see how it looks. If it looks good, then I'll keep it, and if not, I can always paint it out. Since I come from a very, do everything kind of on the fly, it's not a big deal for me to just kind of scrap something midway through. I've done it before, and I'll happily do it if I don't think it's complementing the piece or it really adds any value to the piece. So just bouncing around, trying things, slowly pushing up the values on certain areas just to make them look more three-dimensional and give me an idea of the direction of the lighting. the general direction of the lighting for the piece in my head. Later in the piece, I'll end up establishing it a bit more for the general viewer, but right, it's coming over his shoulder and then more from his left. So you get kind of like almost like a rim light slightly with just more of a direct side profile light. I don't know if that's a good explanation for it, but that's basically what I'm doing. I'm just trying to establish a rough idea on these objects as far as the light, where the light's coming from, and then how those objects look as far as texture and structure with the light hitting them. On the crown, I still wasn't super happy with it, but I didn't want to get too hung up on it, and I just kind of wanted to continue bouncing around and establishing the structure and these values a little more thoroughly and making this look a little more logical as far as how the crown's sitting on his skull. And also the shape of his skull, considering his head's tilted down. I didn't want I was trying to get too hung up on addressing the top of his head constantly. Again, because your eyes get used to what you're looking at, and then you end up becoming, they get kind of lazy more or less, and you don't really see the issues there, which is why a lot of artists actually flip the canvas back and forth. I don't do this. I should, but I don't. I usually just kind of take a break. I generally look at references or, stare off into space for a few minutes. It's kind of my way of giving my eyes a break and stopping and not looking at what I'm working on. But yeah, it's just basically me like rebuilding through this piece slowly and trying to decide like the kind of fabrics I want and how I want them to be structured as far as values, and do I want them to be super shiny or do I want them to be rather I guess matte, not matte finish, but like a very diffused light texture. So it's between bouncing back and forth on that and then working on his skull. I think for this whole first sitting, my entire focus was work a little bit on the general piece, but really focus on the skull and the crown. So that's basically me just building through, slowly putting in the values for his chest, then building back up through his jaw, working around the rest of the piece. It's all, just basically bouncing around. It just makes things easier. A lot of people get hyper focused when they're working on pieces, and they end up working on one area for far too long, and then that one area looks way blown out compared to the rest of the piece. So it's always good to work on one area for 5 or 10 minutes and then go to the next area and work on that for the same amount of time, and just consistently do that over and over again. So that way everything comes up to speed at the same time, so it doesn't look weird. I will say I didn't exactly heed that advice, that knowledge, whatever you want to consider it, on his arm, his hand, and his staff. I think it took me like 3 sittings actually to actually work through his arm, hand, and staff. I didn't do it in this sitting, but I think in the next one and the one after that, I sat there and kind of, there was like, they're like the neglected parts of the pieces, of the piece, I should say. So a lot of this was just me focusing through on the main section of him, his shoulder, the crown. Anytime that I look away from the camera, by the way, I'm looking at the references and other art pieces I have up on my monitors. Usually when I work on these illustrations, I like to pull up other people's work, whether it's how they painted something, the composition, the structure of what they painted, or I just like to get like cool texture ideas from what they've done in their pieces, whether it's like some kind of weird reptile guy or a dragon, whatever it may be. I always have work up on another monitor to kind of look at as inspiration and just like kind of an interesting thing, like maybe different things to try and add to my piece as far as textures or the way they drew fabric or the way they approached drawing skulls, or the texture on hard surfaces that like maybe I could emulate on the crown. Just trying to really think outside the box so I'm not just kind of glued to the same things that I already know, because at the end of the day there's really no fun in that. I always enjoy observing other people's work, because there's always something to learn from it, and there's always something different to try and new to try. I came to the realization that I really probably should put in some collarbones, because if it's if it's an undead living kind of creature, at least if it's somewhat of a human form, so they should have collarbones. So I roughly put in the collarbones, and then I decided, hey, let's put in the rest of the background here. Let's work on the right side of him, because he's got these 4 skulls on his shoulder. So let's let's try and work through this so they don't lag behind, like, you know, like I mentioned earlier. So I think for a good portion of the rest of this, I ended up working kind of through the rest of him, but I also really heavily focus on the right side of him and the skulls, just working through his collarbones, trying to get his skin kind of laid in, or at least like a rough block-in texture-ish thing of his skin. Making sure these skulls are oriented how I want. The original sketches of them I was fine with, but as I started to paint this in and really and bring it to life, I realized that the orientation of them I just wasn't a huge fan of. So a lot of these ended up shifting quite a bit. I originally kind of wanted them all sort of facing the same way, but as I built this piece up, I decided that it looked kind of strange, and it didn't feel very cohesive to me. So I decided to kind of just work back through them and reorient some of them. This one I decided to orient more facing forward, and I think the one behind it kind of kept its shape. I think I reoriented it slightly. Yeah, I did. Okay. The one behind it, I don't remember. I think I did reorient the one behind it because I thought that it being hidden behind it was kind of poorly read and just didn't come across very well. From a design standpoint, it seemed kind of meh. So I was like, well, I'm sure I get to that later on. Just kind of quickly building through the rest of the right side of him, and then bouncing back and forth through the skulls, and then kind of bouncing over to other areas that catch my eye. I have a tendency of working on one spot, and then I'll like see something on the other side of the piece, and I'll work on that for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I go back to like the side I was just working on. Again, just bouncing around, slowly building up these shapes. Usually, probably should have covered this earlier. Usually when I start working in grayscale, yeah, I definitely should have covered this earlier. Usually when I start working in grayscale, I always try and stick to like a minimum of like maybe 3 values, 4 values at most. It's always generally good to put in your brightest light source, and then have your darkest light source, so you have like the full value contrast to work from in grayscale. I unfortunately don't do this a lot of the time because I have a tendency of sometimes blowing things way out of proportion and going way too crazy. So I sort of slowly work up to it. I use a couple lighter values and a couple dark values to establish things, and then once I've sort of established like what surfaces are what and where the light is coming from, then I start to build up to a slightly to a lot higher end value as far as lights go. So yeah, basically that's how I'm approaching a lot of this right now, because a lot of the skull is all very smooth, hard surface, and the light source is almost directly on top of them the way I had designed the piece. Which the further in we go here, probably in the next like 2 minutes, you'll start to see me putting in a little bit of a brighter value in the background on the right side of the piece. And then I'll be pumping up the values on the skulls. I decided to add another one in the back just because having a little bit of dead space back there felt a little strange. And it definitely, I think it works for the most part. And then I decided to work back through this kind of belt thing that these skulls are harnessed to. I originally wanted to make it a little more mechanical. I wanted the skulls to look like they're attached to the belt, like you could see like chain or some kind of apparatus holding them to the belt, but I couldn't really think of anything that wouldn't be too cluttering and in the way to do so, because I really like having something kind of almost like realistically plausible in these illustrations, and not just them like magically attached to something. I want there to be like, oh, this is attached by chain or like bolts or whatever. But I couldn't really think of anything that wouldn't be super intrusive to the whole piece, based on how the perspective of it is and how more of a close-up it is. I just thought it would be very cluttering and kind of obnoxious, so I decided not to do that. Maybe next time if I attempt to paint this guy again at some point in the future, I'll try and do something a little more spicy in that regard, is making things look a little more plausible in reality. Although it's a Death Weaver, so I don't really know how plausible those are. But yeah, so basically working back through the background, reestablishing my darks, and then trying to bring some of this stuff down in value a little more, now that I realize that the left side of the piece is going to be a lot darker and the right side of the piece is going to be a lot lighter. So you're going to have that good push-pull effect as far as contrast. So just working back through the skull, the shape of the skull and the crown. I'm pretty sure at this point of the piece I didn't really like the crown. I was contemplating other ways of working it out, so to speak. But everything I thought of just kind of seemed silly. Like I was like, oh, maybe I'll do a hood, but I'm like, the hood's kind of a cop out and it's kind of silly, and I don't know. There's really no point in doing that. It wouldn't look very good, so I just stuck with the crown. And yeah, it just happens in some pieces for a very long time until you get towards the end of a piece. You may not just like an entire section of the piece, and that's completely normal. I'm pretty sure as of right now, the crown's gone through, I think, 3 iterations or 4 iterations of how I wanted it designed and like the kind of materials I wanted it made out of and all that stuff. And I think at this point I'm happier with it, but it's not exactly what I was hoping it to be. But that's normal. I realized that like the collarbone and the chest looked a little weird, so I was just going back through and kind of reworking some of those values. Then I decided to jump to the armor plate a little bit, kind of work some of that stuff out a little more. And then I noticed that the shirt needed, like the clothing needed a little more loving. So I'm basically looking for fabric right now, fabric and armor reference, so that way I can get a good idea of like what kind of fabric I want them to have and how I want the armor to be, as far as like how reflective, how much light's hitting it. And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, like based off the light source that I've generated, which is from the right side mostly, how a lot of that light is going to affect the other side of him, considering most of them will be out of the light. So it's just a lot of painting for a little while, and then looking and thinking, and then going back and working back through some of these sections, bringing up these values on the skull, because the high points of objects that are close to the light source are always the ones that catch direct light regardless. So it's just working back through this stuff kind of slowly and like establishing a little more texture and just form without going too crazy overboard. I think in this part, I don't know if I painted the teeth at all here. I think I put them in as just like a rough block in. I can't remember. I remember my main focus for this whole part of the beginning, it was just to get most of him, I want to say like 30-40% blocked in, and then get the skull to like 50-60%. I don't know if I guess I could say I achieved that to some degree, but a lot of it I was still kind of unhappy with after I got done painting for the day, and I ended up going back and fixing quite a bit of it and adjusting things. But as of right now, I'd say I'm pretty happy with it, considering where it's sitting, 3 or 4 sessions later. So I'd say it's getting to a pretty good point right now. I'm just kind of looking over everything that I've put in and seeing if there's anything that really pops out to me. Just doing like minor value adjustments here and there. Yeah, nothing crazy. Just kind of double checking certain areas, adjusting some of the values. Some of these edges were a little too harsh, so I wanted to bring them down in value a bit. And then I was trying to decide if I wanted to bring the backside of the crown down a little bit more, which I did slightly, but nothing too intrusive. Yeah, and then working through these little dots, basically, more or less, just like little value shifts on edges, just to make sure the edge control wasn't crazy and didn't really scream at you when you looked at it. And then I was trying to figure out how to approach the neck part of the fabric for like a good portion of this, because I wanted it to be an edge, kind of, because, I mean, everything in life has an edge to some degree, soft or hard, but I wasn't really sure how to approach it that I'd like and what kind of fabric I wanted it to have. So there are times you'll see, obviously, I bounced around a bit and touched on some of the fabric on like that lower neck, the darker neck value, right where his skin meets his shirt, but I wasn't entirely happy with it, and I wasn't sure how I wanted to approach it. So it's like it was minute adjustments here and there while bouncing around and basically dealing with like the weird dimensional shape of the crown on his head and making sure that what would be called ellipse didn't look weird based on the perspective of it, and then softening some of these edges on his jaw and on the sides of his skull and the crown itself and like around his collarbones. So it was a lot of just kind of touch up and finesse work, more or less. Not going too crazy, just because this is only like the first sitting of the piece, and you're not gonna get a piece done in one sitting. Especially after staring at it. This is like a 3-hour session, I think. So a lot of it was just working slowly through, and then as I got closer and closer to just kind of being done working on the piece for the day, just trying to find the minor things that stood out to me that really bothered me, making sure I took my breaks and let my eyes adjust to whatever I was working on, and slowly working in those areas a little bit at a time. Yeah, just really minute changes. Anyway, there's like 3 minutes left of this, so we're getting to the end. I don't really do a lot more than this. Minor changes. I'm pretty sure I worked back through the skull on the right side of his shoulder. I put in a little bit more value on his arm. I'm not sure if I do it on his hand though. But I tried to bring other things up to speed, and then I realized I was like, okay, I'll work on his hand a little bit, and I was like, I don't really like the positioning of his fingers. I'm not gonna worry about that. Fun fact, I'm terrible at drawing fingers, and I always have been. And I've gotten better over the years, just like, every other artist struggles. But at the end of the day, I'm still terrible at drawing fingers and hands. I always try to incorporate them in my art, just because that's always something I want to get better at. But man, they are tricky and unforgiving. Totally forgot. Yeah, I changed the armor piece. So I was looking at the armor, and I was like, this looks a little cliche and lame. So maybe if I do like three scale plate type things, that would be kind of neat and different. So it gave me, and I don't really do armor in my pieces much, so I thought this would be a fun opportunity to kind of sit there and mess with like reflective surfaces and see how I'd like doing this, like having armor incorporated on my character. I think after this stage of the piece, I was kind of uneasy about it being there. It kind of felt like it didn't fit, but I didn't change it. And now where the piece is, which you guys will see in the next couple of weeks, it feels better, but it was still very sort of uneasy add-in that I did that I wasn't sure if it really fit or worked with the piece. No, I'm just basically was showing someone who came into the stream like where the piece started when I sat down to start working on it, and where it is now, which I do from time to time when people pop in that enjoy watching this stuff. But anyway, there's only like 40 seconds left on this. I appreciate you guys listening to 20 minutes of me vomit about how I'm working through the piece and just giving you kind of my step-by-step. I hope this is informative, helpful, enjoying to watch, entertaining. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Hope we gave you a bit more insight on the process of how I build these pieces up. I look forward to sharing the rest of this process with you and you being able to watch. I don't want to talk too much because I don't know how much more time I have, but thanks for watching. Be sure to leave a like, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye!